When respected airline executive Julia Montgomery notices a disturbing pattern in the customer complaints, she does something unexpected. She goes undercover as an ordinary traveler on her billionaire husband's own airline. Armed with hidden recording devices and her investigative journalist instincts, she's about to experience firsthand the shocking discrimination happening right under his nose. What begins as a simple fact-finding mission quickly turns into a high-stakes confrontation that will expose a culture of judgment where the phrase, "no entry for the poor," is more than just whispered words. It's company policy. The sleek glass doors of Kennedy International Airport slid open as Julia Montgomery adjusted her deliberately worn backpack. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, not a hint of makeup on her face. A pair of old jeans, a faded gray sweater, and scuffed sneakers completed her transformation. No one would guess this woman in modest clothing was the wife of Alexander Montgomery, founder and CEO of Skyline Airways. Jules checked her phone one last time, the voice recorder app already running. 3 new emails from disgruntled customers had arrived, all forwarded from former colleagues at the Consumer Advocacy Bureau. "Same pattern," she whispered, scrolling through the complaints. "First-class tickets mysteriously downgraded. Passengers with insufficient appearance moved to the back of the plane." As she approached the gleaming Skyline terminal with its signature blue and silver decor, Jules recalled the dinner that had set this operation in motion. "Alex, have you noticed these complaints?" she'd asked her husband, sliding a folder across their dining table. He'd barely looked up from his acquisition paperwork. "HR handles customer service, Jules. I trust my team." "Your team hasn't been on the ground floor in years," she'd replied, her journalist instinct prickling. Something's changed in the culture. But Alex had merely kissed her forehead. "If it bothers you so much, why don't you look into it? You're still the best investigative mind I know." He'd meant it as a placating comment, not an actual suggestion. But Julia Montgomery, who had once gone undercover for 6 months to expose corruption in pharmaceutical pricing, knew an assignment when she heard one. Now stepping onto the polished floor of the Skyline terminal, Jules slipped fully into character. Alexandra Jules Whitaker, her maiden name, flying first class to Chicago on a ticket purchased with cash. No frequent flyer number, no digital footprint connecting her to the Montgomery empire. A woman in her 60s struggled with her carry-on nearby. A Skyline employee walked straight past her, not pausing to offer assistance. Jules helped the woman lift her bag onto the scale. "Thank you, dear," the woman said, patting Jules's arm. "Not like the old days when they'd jump to help you, is it?" "No, ma'am, it's not," Jules replied, noting how the same employee was now eagerly assisting a man in an expensive suit. As she approached the check-in counter, Jules activated her small recording device. While Alexander focused on expansions and acquisitions, she had noticed something rotting at the core of his company, a creeping elitism that violated everything her husband had originally built the airline to represent. Today, she would experience it firsthand. The line for first-class check-in moved steadily forward. Jules observed quietly, her journalist's eye cataloging every detail. A well-dressed couple with designer luggage received enthusiastic smiles and offers of champagne. An elderly gentleman in a simple sweater vest was treated with barely concealed impatience. "This isn't what you wanted," Jules thought, picturing Alex when he'd first launched Skyline Airways. They'd been newly married then, her career in investigative journalism taking off just as his airline began to grow beyond its humble beginnings. Dignity shouldn't be a luxury item, he'd told investors. Every passenger deserves respect, regardless of the price of their ticket. Now, as Skyline's stock soared and Alex spent more time in boardrooms than terminals, something fundamental had changed. "Miss Whitaker?" Jules looked up. The airline representative, Melissa, according to her name tag, waited with an impatient expression. "Yes, sorry," Jules said, stepping forward with her ID and ticket. She deliberately fumbled with her worn wallet, playing the part of someone unaccustomed to first-class travel. Melissa took Jules's documentation with perfectly manicured fingers, her expression shifting subtly as she assessed Jules's appearance. The slight downturn at the corners of her mouth spoke volumes. "You're in first class?" Her tone carried thinly veiled skepticism. "Yes," Jules replied simply, adding a touch of nervousness. "It's my first time." Melissa turned to her colleague, a woman with a supervisor pin on her blazer. Their whispered conversation was just low enough that Jules couldn't catch the words, but their glances told the story. This was exactly what Jules had been waiting for. The night before, Alex had caught her studying the airline seating charts. "Working late?" he'd asked, loosening his tie after another 14-hour day. Jules had quickly switched screens. "Just some research." He'd massaged her shoulders. "I miss the days when we'd both stay up building our dreams." For a moment, Jules had considered telling him everything, the complaints, the patterns, her suspicions, but the exhaustion in his eyes stopped her. Alex needed evidence, not theories. Now, as the supervisor approached with a practiced smile, Jules activated the secondary recording device in her jacket pocket. "Miss Whitaker, I'm Linda Peterson, customer service supervisor," the woman said smoothly. "I'm afraid there's been a slight issue with your booking." Jules tilted her head, the perfect picture of confusion. "What kind of issue?" "I confirmed everything yesterday. It appears there was an overbooking in first class. We'll need to reassign you to economy. It's our standard procedure to reassign based on loyalty status, and since you don't appear to be a frequent flyer with us." "But I paid for first class," Jules protested. Linda's smile tightened. "Yes, and you'll receive a partial refund for the difference. Perhaps next time." Behind Linda, Jules caught Melissa whispering to another colleague. "No entry for the poor. They should stick to budget airlines." The colleague suppressed a laugh, unaware that they'd just provided exactly the evidence Jules needed. The real investigation had begun. "I'd like to speak with another representative, please," Jules said calmly, maintaining her character while mentally documenting every detail. Linda's posture stiffened, her controlled exhale betraying her irritation with a difficult customer. "Miss Whitaker, I assure you there's no one else who can help you. This is standard procedure when we need to reassign seats." Linda's professional veneer remained intact, but just barely. "Perhaps if you were a Skyline Elite member or a regular first-class passenger, we could make other arrangements." Jules noted the implicit bias, status determined not just by membership, but by how you looked, by whether you belonged in premium cabins. This was exactly the pattern the complaints had outlined. "I understand," Jules said, her voice taking on a slight tremor of disappointment. "It's just that I saved up for this experience. It was supposed to be special." For a fraction of a second, something like genuine sympathy flickered across Linda's face, quickly replaced by practiced neutrality. Behind the counter, Melissa rolled her eyes at her colleague, no longer bothering to hide her contempt. As Jules accepted her economy boarding pass with reluctance, a well-dressed businessman approached the counter. His tailored suit probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, his leather luggage gleaming under the terminal lights. "Mr. Harrington!" Linda's entire demeanor transformed, her smile reaching her eyes for the first time. "So wonderful to see you again. We have your usual seat ready, and the crew has been notified about your champagne preference." "Actually," Mr. Harrington said, "I need to change my seat. My colleague is joining last minute. Is there any possibility of upgrading him to first class as well?" "Let me see what I can do," Linda responded eagerly. "Oh, it seems we're quite full today, but yes, I believe we can make an exception." Jewel felt a surge of vindication mixed with disappointment. The seat that supposedly didn't exist had materialized instantly for the right person. Making her way toward security, Jules reflected on Alex's journey. He'd started Skyline with a genuine vision, democratizing luxury travel, treating everyone with dignity. Somewhere along the way, that vision had become corrupted. A gentle touch on her arm interrupted her thoughts. It was the older woman she'd helped earlier. "They did it to you too, didn't they?" she asked, her eyes knowing. "I saw them downgrade you. Happens to me all the time. I've stopped dressing up for flights since it never seems to matter." "Does this happen often?" Jules asked, maintaining her cover. "Oh my dear, it's become quite the pattern. My late husband and I used to fly first class everywhere in the 80s. Back then, they judged you on your ticket, not your appearance. Now?" She shook her head. "I've learned to bring proof. Photographs of me with celebrities, references to my family foundation. Isn't that ridiculous? Having to prove I belong?" As they walked together toward security, the woman introduced herself as Margaret Whitfield, a philanthropist who had been flying with Skyline since its inception. "The shame of it is," Margaret continued, "Skyline used to be different. That young man who started it? What was his name? Alexander Montgomery, Jules supplied carefully. Yes, that's him. He used to walk through the cabins himself, greeting everyone. Had such vision. Shame what happens when companies get too big. As Jules approached security, she noticed Caroline Winters, Skyline's chief of customer experience, being escorted through the expedited lane. The woman who had assured Alex that customer satisfaction was at an all-time high. Jules ducked her head, not wanting to be recognized. Caroline hadn't met her often enough to identify her immediately, especially in this attire, but she couldn't risk the operation being compromised too soon. Watching Caroline breeze through security without so much as a glance at the regular travelers waiting in long lines, Jules felt her resolve strengthen. This wasn't just about a few rude employees or isolated incidents. The problem was cultural and systemic, and it reached the highest levels of Skyline's management. The evidence was mounting, and Jules was just getting started. The boarding area for Flight 743 to Chicago buzzed with activity as Jules positioned herself near the gate counter. She observed the young gate agent Trevor, whose smile fluctuated depending on who approached him. First class and Skyline Elite members may begin boarding now, Trevor announced. Jules watched as Linda, the supervisor from check-in, appeared behind the gate. She whispered something to Trevor, glancing meaningfully toward Jules before walking away. A familiar pattern unfolded during boarding. Passengers in designer clothes sailed through with warm welcomes, while those in more modest attire received cursory nods. One elegant woman had her carry-on taken by a flight attendant despite it being well within size limits. "Let me help you with that, Mrs. Davidson. We want you comfortable." When Jules's economy group was called, Trevor's welcoming expression visibly cooled as she approached. "Boarding pass?" he asked flatly. Jules presented her ticket, the downgrade from first class prominently displayed. "You'll need to check that bag," Trevor said, pointing to her backpack. "We're out of overhead space in the main cabin." "The boarding just started," Jules remarked. "How could you be out of space already?" "It's company policy to ensure premium customers have priority for overhead storage," Trevor stated with practiced efficiency. "Your bag will need to be checked." A passenger behind Jules, a middle-aged man in a simple polo shirt, spoke up. "Excuse me, but I just saw you let several larger bags through without comment." Trevor's professional mask slipped momentarily. "Sir, I'm following company protocol. If you have a complaint, you're welcome to contact customer service." As Jules reluctantly surrendered her backpack, having already transferred her recording devices to her pockets, she overheard Trevor mutter to his colleague, "Economy passengers think they deserve first-class treatment." The colleague glanced at Jules and replied with a smirk, "They should be grateful they're on the plane at all. No entry for the poor, remember?" On board, the class division was even more pronounced. First class gleamed with soft lighting and plush seats, flight attendants offering hot towels and welcome drinks. As Jules continued toward economy, the atmosphere changed dramatically. Harsher lighting, cramped space, and noticeably less enthusiastic flight attendants. Taking her middle seat in row 27, Jules found herself between Margaret from earlier and a college student named Jason, who was flying home for his grandmother's birthday. "We meet again," Margaret said warmly. "Seems we've both been exiled to the back of the plane." "I'm starting to think it's not a coincidence," Jules replied. "Oh, it's certainly not," Margaret lowered her voice. "I've been tracking this pattern for months. This isn't just a few rude employees, it's policy." A flight attendant named Heather approached their row, performing a cursory safety check. "Excuse me," Jason called politely. "My tray table seems to be broken." Heather barely glanced at it. "We'll file a maintenance report after landing," she said dismissively, already moving past. As the plane taxied toward the runway, Jules received a text from her contact inside Skyline's corporate office. Found internal memo from Winters. Project appearance matters implemented last year. Training materials explicitly instruct staff to allocate service based on perceived customer value, linked to bonus structures. Jules exhaled slowly. This wasn't a case of a few prejudiced employees. It was systematic discrimination, codified in company policy, incentivized with financial rewards. At cruising altitude, the cabin service began with the familiar forward-to-aft protocol. Through the gap between seats, Jules watched first-class passengers receive custom-plated appetizers and wine poured from actual bottles. Quite the difference from the old days, Margaret commented. Once upon a time, the primary distinction was just seat size and meal quality. Now, it's like they're serving different species. When service reached their row, nearly an hour later, Heather barely made eye contact as she thrust a plastic cup of soda toward Jules. "Water, please," Jules requested. Heather sighed with visible irritation. "I've already poured this one." "I understand, but I'd prefer water if possible." With an exaggerated eye roll, Heather took back the unwanted soda. "I'll see what I can do," she muttered, moving to the next row without returning. "Don't hold your breath," Margaret whispered. "Last month, I asked for a blanket and was told they were reserved for premium passengers only, despite there being a visible stack of them." Midway through the flight, an elderly man 2 rows ahead requested assistance with his medication that had been stored in his now-checked bag. The flight attendant's response was shocking in its callousness. "Sir, you should have thought about that before boarding. There's nothing I can do now." The man's companion pleaded. "Please, it's his heart medication. We didn't expect the bag to be checked." "I'll check when I have time," the attendant replied, but proceeded to spend the next 20 minutes chatting with a colleague in the galley. Jules sent a text to her assistant. "Need background check on Skyline flight attendant Heather Morgan, working flight 743 today." The response came minutes later. 3 formal complaints filed in last month alone, all dismissed by Caroline Winters with notation. Adherence to PAM protocols justified response. Also, bonus structure shows she's received Premium Service Excellence Award twice this quarter. This confirmed Jules's suspicions. Not only were these discriminatory behaviors tolerated, they were rewarded. An hour before landing, Jules pressed her call button. After 5 minutes with no response, despite flight attendants passing by multiple times, she pressed it again. Heather finally approached, irritation evident in every movement. "Yes?" she asked curtly. "I was wondering if I could get a cup of water," Jules said pleasantly. "I asked earlier, but never received it." "We're preparing for landing service. You'll have to wait." Yet across the aisle, a passenger in a business suit had his call button answered immediately, receiving not just water, but a fresh cocktail with a smile. As Jules documented this exchange, Jason noticed her detailed note-taking. "You're really recording all this, aren't you?" he asked quietly. "Are you with the FAA, or some kind of undercover reviewer?" Before Jules could respond, Margaret leaned in. "Whatever she is, I hope she's someone who can finally make changes around here. I've been collecting my own evidence for months." As the plane began its descent, Jules received an urgent message that made her freeze. "Your identity compromised. Caroline Winters is on your flight, seated 2A. She was shown your boarding pass by gate agent. She knows Alexandra Whitaker's fake name. Expect confrontation upon landing." Jules's mind raced. Her cover was blown, but perhaps that could work to her advantage. The original plan had been to compile evidence and present it to Alexander privately, but now circumstances had changed. The plane touched down as the captain welcomed passengers to Chicago. Jules noticed unusual activity in first class. Caroline Winters was standing despite the seatbelt sign, speaking urgently to the lead flight attendant and gesturing toward the back of the plane. "I think we're about to have some excitement," Margaret whispered. Jules took a deep breath. "It seems my timetable has been accelerated." "Whoever you are," Jason said, "we've got your back." The confrontation Jules had been preparing for was about to begin, just much sooner and much more publicly than she had planned. "Stay in your seats," Caroline Winters commanded as passengers began to stand. "Security situation." A ripple of concern moved through the cabin. Jules remained seated, her expression calm despite her racing heart. Caroline reached row 27, her perfectly coiffed blonde hair and designer suit marking her as distinctly out of place in economy. Her eyes locked onto Jules with cold recognition. "You," she said, voice tight with controlled fury. "I need you to come with me immediately." Jules looked up with deliberate innocence. "Is there a problem?" "Identity fraud is a federal offense," Caroline announced loudly. "Attempting to fly under a false name?" "My ID matched my boarding pass," Jules interrupted calmly. "The name is legally mine, Alexandra Jules Whitaker. No fraud involved." Caroline's eyes narrowed. "You deliberately misrepresented yourself. Security will escort you for questioning." Around them, passengers were murmuring in confusion. Several raised phones, recording the confrontation. "Ms. Winters," Jules said clearly, "I've been recording since I entered the terminal this morning. Every interaction, every comment, every example of Skyline's Project Appearance Matters directive in action." Caroline blanched visibly. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't you?" Jules stood slowly. "The internal policy instructing staff to judge customers by their appearance, the directive to prioritize service to passengers who look the part of premium travelers, the bonus structure rewarding employees who maintain class distinctions." The lead flight attendant took a half step back, her eyes widening in recognition. "Who are you?" Caroline demanded, though her tone suggested she already suspected. Jules straightened to her full height. "My name is Julia Montgomery, and yes, that Montgomery. I believe you know my husband Alexander, the founder and CEO of Skyline Airways." A collective gasp rippled through the cabin, followed by the unmistakable sound of smartphones capturing the moment. "Mrs. Montgomery," the lead flight attendant stammered, "we had no idea." "That was rather the point," Jules replied. "I wanted to experience what ordinary customers experience, and what I found was shameful." Caroline attempted to regain control. "This is an internal company matter. We should discuss this privately." "No," Jules said firmly. "Discrimination shouldn't be hidden behind closed doors. Every passenger deserves to know how they are being judged based on appearance." Margaret stood beside Jules. "I've been documenting the same patterns for months, downgraded despite paid first-class tickets, ignored by staff, treated as less than human because I don't look wealthy enough." Jason added, "They made my grandmother check her medical equipment because she was wearing simple clothes. She's a retired surgeon who's flown over 1 million miles with Skyline." Other passengers began calling out similar experiences. The dam of silence broken. A flight attendant in the back stepped forward. "It's true," she said, her voice trembling. "We were told to categorize passengers by appearance. Service allocation based on visual value assessment, they called it. I hated it, but I needed this job." Caroline turned on her furiously. "Jennifer, that's enough!" But Jennifer continued. "They track our premium service ratio, how much time we give to well-dressed passengers versus others. If the ratio is too balanced, we get reprimanded." Jules addressed the cabin. "My investigation isn't aimed at punishing employees. This is about systems that corrupt good people by incentivizing the wrong behaviors." She turned to Caroline, who was now visibly seething. "Ms. Winters, I believe my husband will want a full report on how his company's founding principles have been undermined." The passengers erupted in applause, smartphones still recording. Jules knew the footage would be online before they even deplaned. "Now," Jules said, her tone softening, "I suggest we allow these passengers to deplane. They've experienced enough Skyline drama for one day." As people began gathering their belongings, many paused to shake Jules's hand or share their own stories. Margaret gave her a warm hug. "You remind me of myself in my younger days," she whispered, "never afraid to stand up for what's right." Jules's phone buzzed with a text from Alexander. "Just saw footage from the plane. Why didn't you tell me? Coming to Chicago tonight. We have work to do." 3 weeks later, Jules stood before a packed auditorium at Skyline Airways headquarters. Alexander stood beside her, his presence both supportive and symbolic of the changes already underway. "Thank you all for coming," Jules began. "Today isn't about dwelling on past mistakes, but about returning to the original vision that founded this airline." On the screen behind her, the original Skyline mission statement appeared: "To provide dignity in travel for all passengers, regardless of ticket class or personal background." Alexander stepped forward. "When I started this company, this wasn't just a marketing slogan. It was our purpose. Somewhere along the way, we lost sight of that. I take responsibility for becoming disconnected from our daily operations." Jules gestured to Margaret Whitfield and Jennifer, the flight attendant who had spoken up. "These women have agreed to help us rebuild our culture." Margaret described her new role heading the Passenger Dignity Committee, a group of diverse frequent flyers who would provide regular feedback on their experiences. Jennifer nervously approached the microphone. 3 weeks ago, I was terrified I'd lose my job for speaking up. Instead, I've been asked to help train staff on the new service protocols." Jules returned to center stage. "We've eliminated the discriminatory policies, the The Project Appearance Matters directive has been terminated, along with the bonus structures that rewarded treating some passengers better than others. She displayed the new service metrics, customer satisfaction scores that made no distinction between cabin classes, response times to call buttons that required equal attention to all sections. But policy changes are just the beginning, Jules continued. True transformation requires a cultural shift. Alexander rejoined her. That's why we're implementing comprehensive retraining for all customer-facing staff. Not to teach you to treat everyone equally, I believe you already know how to do that, but to undo the conditioning that suggested otherwise. Jules noticed Caroline Winters sitting in the back row. After the Chicago incident, Caroline had expected to be fired. Instead, Alexander had given her a choice: resign or help fix the system she had corrupted. To everyone's surprise, she had chosen the latter. No one will be terminated based on past actions that followed company directives, Jules explained. Instead, we're offering everyone the chance to be part of the solution. As the presentation concluded, a senior flight attendant asked, "Mrs. Montgomery, premium passengers pay more. Don't they deserve more attention?" Jules nodded. Premium passengers deserve the enhanced comfort and amenities they pay for. A wider seat, better food, priority boarding. What they don't deserve is more human dignity or basic respect. The difference should be in the product, not in how we value the person. Later, Caroline approached Jules and Alexander. "I owe you both an apology," she said stiffly. "I convinced myself I was maximizing revenue, but I lost sight of the human cost." "Everyone deserves a second chance," Jules replied thoughtfully, "even executives who make serious mistakes." As Jules and Alexander walked through the quiet terminal that evening, they paused by a photograph of Skyline's first airplane. "You know what the strangest part is?" Alexander said. "I never noticed the changes happening. It was so gradual, each justified by revenue or efficiency." Jules squeezed his hand. "That's how principles erode, not all at once, but bit by bit, until one day you're running a company you wouldn't recognize." "Thank you," he said softly, "for being brave enough to show me the truth." 6 months later, Jules stood at the gate of Skyline Flight 743 to Chicago, the same route where her investigation had reached its dramatic conclusion. This time, she wasn't undercover. The changes were immediately visible. The gate area had been redesigned to eliminate the visible separation between premium and economy passengers. The boarding process now moved smoothly, emphasizing courtesy rather than status. Trevor, the gate agent, was now helping an elderly gentleman with his boarding pass. When he spotted Jules, he gave a small nod. "Mrs. Montgomery, it's good to see you again." "Jules, please," she corrected gently. "How are things going with the new protocols?" "Better than I expected," Trevor replied. "There's less tension now that we're not constantly policing who belongs where." On board, Jules took her seat in row 27, the same seat from her investigation. Heather, the flight attendant who had been so dismissive before, approached with obvious discomfort. "Mrs. Montgomery, Jules," she corrected with a smile. "And please, no discomfort. We're all moving forward together." Heather's shoulders relaxed. "Thank you for that. Water today?" she asked with a small note of humor. Throughout the flight, Jules observed the changes. Call buttons were answered promptly, regardless of cabin section. Flight attendants addressed passengers by name when possible, their interactions genuine rather than performative. After landing, Jules recognized Margaret Whitfield in the aisle. "Jules Montgomery, what a surprise." She gestured to the man beside her. "This is my brother Henry. I was just telling him how different Skyline feels now." "It's still a work in progress," Jules acknowledged, "but we're committed to the journey." "That's all any of us can ask," Margaret replied. "To be seen as human beings, not walking wallets. You've started something important here. Other airlines are noticing." Indeed, several competing airlines had announced their own dignity initiatives since Jules's investigation went public. Alexander was waiting in the terminal. "How was it?" he asked, embracing her. "Genuine progress," she replied. "Not perfect, but moving in the right direction." They walked together through O'Hare, passing another airline's gate where passengers were clearly being sorted by appearance. "There's still so much work to do," Jules observed. Alexander nodded. "But at least we've started the conversation. People are becoming more aware of dignity as a fundamental right, not a luxury item." Jules paused, watching the stream of travelers flowing through the terminal. What happened at Skyline isn't just about air travel. It's about how easily we categorize people, how quickly we decide who deserves our best selves and who doesn't. And how those judgments are almost always based on superficial things, Alexander added. Exactly. That's why sharing these stories matters, because every time someone recognizes themselves in the struggle, either as the judged or the one judging, there's an opportunity for change. In an age where dignity sometimes seemed like a luxury reserved for the privileged few, the true revolution was remembering that it belonged to everyone, regardless of what they wore, how they looked, or where they sat on the plane. And that was a story worth telling. If this story moved you, hit subscribe and share in the comments when you've been judged by appearance. True worth isn't in clothes or status, but how we treat each other. Our generation knows substance matters more than style. Join us tomorrow for another story that might change your perspective on the world around you.